Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Marlo Thurman with the U.S. Autism Association. And I'm here today with Dr. Megan Locke, who is the Executive Director of the Able Kids Foundation. And she's going to share with us some really great information about central auditory processing and kind of the ways that we can address that for kids with autism. Hi, Dr. Locke. How are you?
Hello, good morning, Marlo. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for being with
Um,
us today.
oh, thank
Let's start. Let's start by just having you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe give us the background about kind of what Able Kids Foundation is and what you guys do there.
Sounds great. So I've been at the Able Kids Foundation for 13 years. Central Auditory Processing Disorder was actually a passion of mine in grad school. We're not taught this very much. But it was early on where I felt like the auditory system was far more important for overall function than we gave it credit for. So, most of us just specialize with the hearing, and as an audiologist, most of us go into the hearing aid realm. But for me, that auditory system seemed far more complex. And um, in undergrad, I had a lot of experience working with students with special needs in a preschool setting, and so I really became passionate more about the sensory processing side. So my fourth year externship took me to a sound therapy center in New Jersey, which was fascinating. I became a certified Tomatis consultant, AIT consultant, fast forward and rhythmic entrainment intervention consultant. So did a lot of those therapies for kids and adults that had processing challenges, and the results and what I saw were fascinating, but I saw them not necessarily always coincide with helping to understand in noise, which as an audiologist, that was my focus. So shortly after I spent some time there, an opportunity came up to join the Able Kids Foundation. We all dream of our dream job. This was it for me.
That's
We moved
awesome.
from Yes, we moved from Washington, D.C. to Colorado for the Able Kids Foundation, and we're here 13 years later. What I loved about the Able Kids Foundation was one, that our testing and management protocols were very grounded in data. We're actually a continuation of a program that started at Colorado State University in the 1970s. Around 2006, all of that work transferred to the Able Kids Foundation. So I just really loved the data behind everything that we did. And we also had a tool in the filter, which we can talk about later. It was the first thing I knew of that was one based in data, two, but to say, okay, you don't have to work so hard. I liken it to glasses. If a kiddo hasn't been able to see the board clearly for years, you can finally give them a choice and say, this should help. It was the first thing I felt like I had the ability to tell a family and students that, yes, you're working really hard, but you don't have to anymore. And that was really exciting for me.
That's
So,
great. Yeah,
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
awesome. So for people who don't know what central auditory processing disorder is, let's talk about that just a little tiny bit. In other words, can you go into a little bit more depth and maybe discriminate that? Because a lot of people may think that is, a hearing test, and my kid hears fine,
Yeah.
so therefore everything is fine because they have a normal hearing. So can you discriminate
Yeah.
that for us from
Yeah.
hearing?
Yeah. And so, when most of us think about our their ears, we think of just the hearing, that hearing test. But our auditory system does far more than just perceive the presence of sound. And so once we perceive sound, then our system has to understand and assign meaning to it. So just because we hear something doesn't mean we understand it. I liken it to going to a foreign country where you don't speak the language. You hear everybody talking around you, but it doesn't mean that it makes sense. We've had students with really significant cases say, Dr. Locke, my teacher in class sounds like this, wah, 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 wah. It doesn't make sense to them. So there's that understanding piece. But then there's also that filtering component. Our auditory system also has to suppress and prioritize sounds constantly in our environment. An efficient system knows what's important to listen to and what's not important to listen to. And so it's constantly filtering out lights, fans, clocks, flies in the classroom, typing on keyboards so that we don't have to do that. For the students and adults that we see, their system doesn't filter as efficiently. It brings all the sounds to them. And then the responsibility to try to sort out, what's important to listen to, what's important to focus on, rests on their shoulders. And that's exhausting for them. Their brain just gets so overloaded and overstimulated. So the individuals that we see, it's that not the hearing part. They're hearing just fine. They've got excellent hearing. A lot of times our students get told your hearing is perfect. You just need to try a little bit harder without that individual realizing, well, there's two other really important components that auditory system has to do. And it's important we check that out as well.
And that's interesting. You talk about the perfect hearing. I owned a school for about 10 years, and we had about 25% of the kids in the building were on the spectrum. And this is when I first really got interested in auditory processing discrimination, especially those differences in my current autism. We had one of those one of those frequency generators that had, you could see the waves
Oh,
that
yes.
accompanied the sound, and it was tied to the string, and it was moving, it was in a science class. And, here's the guy, he's turning it up. He's like, okay, now humans usually don't hear this sound.
Right.
And, I'm like, here's my kids on the spectrum. Well, I can hear that.
Yes.
And then he's turning it up past the range that, dogs don't hear this sound. And my kids on the spectrum are like, well, I can still hear that. So he came and got me, and we did a little kind of ad hoc research project, had them put their heads down so they couldn't see, couldn't see the string and couldn't see him adjusting, and just raise your hand if you can hear this sound. And it was so fascinating that my kids on the spectrum could hear frequencies, especially in that really, really high range, that none of the other kids could hear. And not just by a little bit, by almost like 2 standard deviations higher frequencies. And I think so that's what got me interested. And that's when I originally connected with able kids and started kind of exploring that in my own assessment practice in terms of testing for listening and noise, with the idea that, wow, looks a little different, that these kids hear so well.
Yes. And so that's one reason we liken it to super hearing, because that's something that they can understand. This is often genetic. It is what it is. We don't want them to feel like something's wrong. My hair is red, my eyes are blue. It's part of what makes me me. For some of us, we have this very acute sense of sound. And it's interesting. Sometimes we'll tell the kids, did you know you have super hearing? And they look at us like, well, yes. I've been hearing all these things all my life that my parents can't hear. The other thing that it does is that, a lot of these kids work so hard, and we try to, tell them it's one of your strengths. It's something you do really well at, but we just want to make sure you can control those noises better, that you're the boss of the noises, and that makes them really excited too. But can you imagine hearing everything in your world all the time? There would be a lot more frustrated, exhausted, irritable people in the world. We take for granted, when we have efficient systems, how well it prioritizes and suppresses those unwanted, unnecessary sounds for us all day.
Right. And you know what? Yeah. When I did my dissertation with adults with autism, and kind of got, kind of reports, and what it was is a study with, 20, 30 adults who are saying, here's what autism is. Here's what autism means to me. Here's how I'm different. Not one of them, there was a lot of differences in terms of learning style and other things, but all of them either had extreme hyperacuity, or they tuned out so extremely that they literally didn't hear the fire alarm going off, or couldn't drive in the car safely because they wouldn't hear if an ambulance pulled up behind them. And that was a really distinct difference. I started testing at about that time. So it's about 10 years. I've tested probably 300 or 400 cases. I have yet to find a single case in my practice of autism that doesn't have a pretty significant difference across their central auditory processing system. And I think you guys are finding that too.
Yes.
Talk to me about that just a minute, and then we're going to talk about assessment. Let's talk about what that assessment looks like. But tell me first about kind of your thoughts about, is this a feature of autism?
I think it is. Obviously we haven't tested everybody with, autism to know, but those sensory challenges run high with this population, including, that auditory processing and
Mhm.
some of those classic reported behaviors of autism with the sensitivity and irritability and anxiety and exhaustion and that overload at the end of the day. It's not all of the auditory, but I don't think that auditory system helps. Are you familiar with the spoon theory?
Go ahead and tell us. I've heard it before,
Yes.
but yeah, go ahead and tell our
I
audience.
think that's a great way to kind of explain the effort that these kiddos put into their day. And it's like we all wake up with 20 spoons during the day, and those spoons represent energy. And if we don't have auditory processing, and we don't have dyslexia, and we don't have autism, and maybe some other things that are on our plate, we don't have to cash in these spoons for easy tasks. But
Mhm.
if you have auditory processing disorder, maybe that bus ride is really loud in the morning and you're overloaded before you get to school. That's 3 spoons. And then you go into class, and your class, there's 25 kids in class, and you're trying really hard to sit on the carpet and listen to your teacher. And that's another 5 spoons. And then you go to gym class, and then music class. And, maybe you have a substitute teacher, and change is really hard. So that's another 5 spoons for you. And by noon, you're out of your spoons.
Right.
And so then, any other task that you have to do, it's like your bucket's full or bucket's empty, excuse me. You don't have anything left to give. So, we all wake up with, a certain amount of gas in our tank in the morning.
Right.
And when we've got other things on our plate that are causing us to expend more energy than we should have to, that's not fair
Right.
to that student. And at some point, we don't see that really they don't have any energy left. And sometimes as human beings, even, I do this for a living, Marlo, and, I'm human. Sometimes I forget with my own kids at the end of the day that they're done. And, if we don't realize that their spoons are all cashed in, they don't have any more energy tickets. Sometimes our expectations are unrealistic for what these kids can do.
Yeah, and that ties really nicely to what we're doing a whole theme right now, and it's on this topic of neurocrash or meltdown with the idea. And by the way, it's interesting you use the bucket, and we talk about the spoons, and we talk about, I think Ron Kaufman talks about the cup, this idea that on the one hand, your energy is going empty, and on the other hand, your capacity to keep it together is getting closer and closer and
Yes.
closer. So it's funny because everyone's
Yeah.
using different terminology, but we're all saying the same thing. When your energy is empty, all it
Yes.
takes is one little more drop in the bucket to spill the bucket, right?
Yes.
Or you're kind of using that you don't have any energy left. And what we're really kind of talking about with across some of these other speakers in this unit is this idea that when you're spent, that you crash, that this is when you
Yeah.
have no cognitive stamina left to think, problem solve. And so then these little triggers can tip you over into
Yeah.
kind of neurological crash or meltdown. And
Yeah.
we've always assumed those to be kind of behavioral, like this child
Yeah.
being obnoxious, when really that's maybe not the case. These kids are just
Right.
done. There's no
They're
energy left
done.
in the tank, and they've
Yeah.
got that one cup too full. And so the bucket is spilling in terms of the emotional system. So it's helpful to kind of put all those analogies together because we're really all saying the same thing, even though we're talking about spoons and buckets and cups
Right.
and water spilling over versus being empty. We're all really saying the same thing. And what I think you're really saying is that auditory processing is a large consumer of that energy.
It is. Our day is full of noises, and we have to remember that when you've got auditory processing challenges, it's not just the loud sounds. Sometimes we think, well, it's just the loud sounds. It's every sound, like you had mentioned with your son. These kids and adults are hearing everything. So, if I walked around and clapped quietly in your ear all day, that's not loud. But that subtle disruption is going to impede your focus, your concentration, whatever that you're doing on your plate, and your little energy needle is going to keep moving towards the empty. And I
Right.
might say, wow, Marlo's holding it really together quite well. And then maybe when you reach that empty, that's when, these kids tantrum or lash out. And, I wish we could see that little energy meter inside them, because I think we would have more understanding of why they go from holding it together 1 second and then done.
Tipped
Um,
over. Yeah.
yeah, because we see these kids are pleasers. They work so hard and they really try to hold it together, but then when they reach that point of overload, they just don't have anything to give. And when we don't see what's happening inside their brain,
Mhm.
it can look like us, like they just decided to fall apart. And it
Well,
can leave us scratching our heads.
absolutely. And I think it's really important that what you're reiterating is that the sound is, we all hear these sounds, but for people who are not on the spectrum or people who don't have auditory processing issues, that they have this kind of internal filter that
Yes.
suppresses some of that so that they're literally not hearing everything. So these
Right.
kids are hearing everything. And one of the other things I hear so often in the clients I work with, it's not the loud sound, it's the sound that startled me, right? And it might have been some little thing, but it was like, ah, and it's
Yeah.
because they're, we think about, we learned in another session, kind of that sympathetic parasympathetic system of arousal, that it's that one little sound that just, and it doesn't have to be a scary sound, but to them it actually feels scary or threatening, or it's the tip over sound, right?
Right. Yep. Hmm.
Yeah. So let's
Yeah.
jump into assessment. What, I
Yeah.
know that your field does assessments, and I know that I've referred to a lot of different audiologists, and the parents come back with this, well, my kid hears perfectly. He's got this 99th percentile score. Why did you send me there?
Yes.
And I'm then disappointed to learn that there's a huge difference in assessment between audiologists for these types of things. Can you talk about your assessment and what you're specifically looking at, especially for kids on the spectrum?
Yes. So, most audiologists are just trained to look at that hearing component. A couple articles recently and surveys showed that in our 8 years of school, we get roughly 12 to 20 hours of central auditory processing training in 8 years, which is, 2 days. It's not enough to train us to one, identify these kids, but then also know how to appropriately test and diagnose and manage.
And by the way, we don't like people's kids because we don't have releases for them.
No. Well, that's why I did this at home, is because I thought if there's conversations at work, we're small and stuff, I didn't want
Yeah,
that. And so, like I said, I've done my board meetings and, a lot of stuff at home for the same reason. And like I said, today it just didn't decide that it
yeah, we're
decided
good.
it didn't like what we were doing.
All right, perfect. Okay, so again, that difference in auditory processing assessments, what you guys do, and the difference between your assessments versus that regular kind of audiology evaluation.
Okay. So when most people go to an audiologist, they typically just get their hearing tested. They're looking at that, again, perception of sound. Did you hear it or did you not? In the central auditory processing assessment, it has to go much further than that component. And a lot of students and adults may not necessarily receive this with the first audiologist they go to, because our training is really lacking in this area. Several journal articles and a survey recently suggested that we get 12 to 20 hours of central auditory processing coursework in our 8 years of school, which is basically 2 days, which is not enough to improve the audiologist's confidence with one, identifying these kids, but also knowing, again, how to test and diagnose and manage these students that are appearing to have awesome hearing, but struggling to understand and connect to their world. So at the foundation, when you join the foundation, you actually go through 2 more years of training, because we know that audiologists just don't get this. And the way that we're a little different from other centers is we have a lot of data, again, from Colorado State University. We're very fortunate to have resources, and tests available to us, and to know which tests are very easy to beat, which ones are more sensitive and specific to the system. One way the foundation is different is we look at the entire system, the cortical level and the brainstem. And I don't want to get it into too much, but there's different parts to the central auditory nervous system. And it is so important that you evaluate all parts. A lot of students will just get an assessment looking at one part, and then they can fall through the cracks. They can be missed. I liken it to breaking your ankle. If the orthopedic doctor you go to only looks at the knee up, they're going to miss that lower part of your leg. So we know that, that system's complex. Again, it's important to have a test battery assessing both the cortical level and the brainstem. And then we also have cross checks within our test battery, which is really important because some of our kids also have anxiety issues or attention, language. Did they not sleep well the night before? Are they worried about something else? It's really important for us to know that we're just isolating that auditory system and nothing else. We did a review of about 100 test batteries used across the country recently. Some really good test batteries, but a lot of them are missing the cross checks. And occasionally we'll read, well, this test suggests central auditory processing disorders, but we're not confident that other attention pieces didn't affect results too. We can, with 100% certainty, with the effort checks in place and the cross checks, know that we are just isolating that system that we want to focus on so that we can either say, yes, this is a piece, or no, it's not. And if it is, put some supports in place to level that child's playing field.
Exactly. And I think that's real important. Let's talk about something really specific. I know I've had kids that I've referred to other centers, primarily before I kind of got in contact with you guys, that, the audiologist was telling, we can't test this child because they have autism. Our our field says we shouldn't be testing kids with autism for auditory processing disorders. Can you talk to us about that a little
Yes.
bit?
That is an area I'm really passionate about because I don't think that it's true. I'm not the only audiologist that says that. There's other audiologists that test autism. I think it goes back to our training. You've got to trust your test battery. You've got to have cross checks in place to know that you're, not assessing other things. But, I liken it to when I talk to parents about this or professionals, I'll say, can you imagine a speech pathologist or an optometrist saying, I know your child has speech and language concerns or vision concerns, but I can't test them because they're on the autism spectrum. I don't understand that. So, with the central auditory processing piece, you're just repeating back what you hear, or you're pointing to pictures. There's some picture task too for those that maybe have selective mutism or nonverbal. We do have a great toolbox of tools where you don't actually have to talk, but to not assess these kids is putting them at extreme risk, in my opinion, for, unnecessarily having to live in a more confusing, chaotic environment. And this piece can affect not only academic performance, but our social connections, our self-esteem, our overall well-being, our ability to want to leave the house, and go to fun restaurants. Some of our kids, they love smash burger hamburgers, but they won't go to the restaurant. You've got to get carry out. And so I haven't seen any research or evidence showing that we can't assess these kids. And when we do assess them, we see a lot of students and adults on the spectrum. We don't see that their profiles differ differently from other people. I liken it to vision. Probably whether you're on the spectrum or not on the spectrum, the audiologist is going to find, or I'm sorry, the optometrist is going to find what they're going to find. We're all different. Our systems are all different. I think for that, for the autism group, I think it's just really important that people understand. I think this is often one more piece on their plate, which, just makes their life harder. And this is an easy piece to control. It's easy to quiet noises, and it's easy to give breaks. And it's once you have a dialogue about central auditory processing and what it means for these kiddos, a lot of our parents walk away with a much better understanding of how their child perceives their environment and why some of these meltdowns and anxieties and rigidities and things are happening, which helps everybody, helps the parents, helps the siblings, helps the teachers. And so for me, the more information that we can have about a child, whether it's auditory, vision, sensory, gut issues, the better we can just support them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, I know you've done some research, and I'm really excited to hear about kind of your research
Yeah.
findings. I know that over the last, how's it been? A couple years that you've been collecting data?
Yes. Well, we have, about 4,000 test batteries and case histories. So,
Uh-huh.
it's all about the time, but we get really interested. And I'll be honest, a lot of the data and the research studies that we do, it comes from parent questions,
Right.
because I can speak to a lot from experience, but I think it's very different to say in my experience versus, well, we looked at that and this is what the data shows. So
Right.
kudos to the parents. I give the parents a lot of credit for what we do, because they've got great questions, and I think the best way to answer those questions is actually quantifiable information if we have it.
Mhm. So,
Yeah.
talk to us maybe a little bit about this study that you guys are doing, and let me clarify: is it with you? Is it kind of central auditory processing in kids with autism? Is that kind of the study that we're talking about?
Yeah, we've got a few different groups we're looking at right now. A random sample of students seen at the foundation, a group of gifted students seen at the foundation, and then a group of students and adults that are on the spectrum. And right now we've compared their reported behaviors on the case history form. We're also looking at kind of their testing profiles, as well, just to see again, is there much of a difference? And we're not seeing that there is. It's not that one group has more brain stem inefficiencies than another. We're seeing, again, the results differ across the board. But the one thing I found interesting is, regardless of whether you were in the sample group or the autism group or the gifted group, people think that gifted means easy, not necessarily. The reported behaviors in the top 10 were roughly the same across the board, which, I find, pretty interesting. We know that just because they're the typical behaviors with central auditory processing challenges are pretty consistent. Once you know what to look for, it's really easy to identify. And there's hallmarks like sensitive to loud sounds and mishearing and being easily distracted. But it was just really interesting to see how all of these really were quite high across groups. So you couldn't say, well, if you're gifted, you don't have CAPD or you don't struggle with sensitivity. We're seeing, it doesn't matter where you fall and what else is on your plate. If you have central auditory processing challenges, it tends to impact you all in relatively the same ways. So, when I was reading more about the autism spectrum disorder, there's a lot of sensory overload information, and they talk about a lot of those behaviors due to sensory overload, like anxiety, frustration, sensitivities, things like that. So I compared that to our case history and reported behaviors. 90% of the students and adults with autism reported anxiety on our case history form. 82 reported frustration. 57 reported irritability, 66% reported that they tire easily, 56% reported temper tantrums, and 87% reported sensitivity to loud sounds. And no, I don't think all of the sensitivities and frustration are auditory. But I don't think that this piece helps with
Right.
those
Exactly.
pieces. Mhm.
It's interesting that you're looking at giftedness, because I have this kind of Marlo, view of one that so many of our kids on the spectrum are kind of innately intellectually pretty high level, even if they don't speak, even if they have, so many challenges that's affecting them. But it's interesting that you're seeing that the in the gifted population and the random, no, non-gifted, non-autistic, and in the autistic groups, central auditory processing disorder is central auditory processing disorder,
Yes.
and that
And
it tests the same and looks the same across all these different groups.
yes. And I'm from the Midwest where, I grew up thinking gifted meant easy. I did not have, any experience with the twice exceptional group until
Hmm.
I came to Able Kids Foundation. And I'll be honest, the gifted group and the kids on the spectrum are my two favorites, because I think both are misunderstood in some ways. The
Right,
gifted group
right.
typically gets put in that lazy, unmotivated bucket, and people don't realize, on our reported behaviors, 79% of gifted students reported they were sensitive to loud sounds. 66 reported anxiety, 71 reported being easily distracted. That's not easy. And then for the other group, sometimes I think they, um, we just assume, well, everybody with autism is just sensitive and that's just the way it is. Yes, these sensitivities tend to occur a lot with that group, but we can still do something about it. We can still help them. We can still, do a central auditory processing evaluation or take them to an OT for the sensory or, whatever it may be. But we can get really good information for this group too to help them better understand their world.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I want to clarify, and tell me if I'm right, is that and I test a lot of gifted kids too. So I test autism, I test gifted twice exceptional, I test a lot of kids. I don't see auditory processing disorder in all of the gifted kids.
Yeah.
I do see auditory processing disorder in, if not all, I haven't yet found one. There's probably somebody out there who doesn't have an auditory processing disorder that is on the autism spectrum, but I have yet to see one. And I think that's, for me, kind of a key difference is, while it looks the same and tests the same and affects them in much the same way, while gifted kids have some sound sensitivity and hyperacuity, not all of them that affects them in the degree of central auditory processing disorder. Whereas in autism, it feels a little more extreme and it feels a little more common. Is that kind of what you're saying?
In my experience, I would agree with you. I think again that we'd have to look really hard to find a student that is has autism that doesn't have central auditory processing challenges to some degree. Whether we haven't tested all of them, but it seems to have a really high prevalence in that population, not necessarily with the gifted. I have talked to other psychologists that test gifted students and adults as well. And I don't think just because you're gifted doesn't mean you have central auditory processing or visual processing or dyslexia. It just
occurs,
sometimes you do.
right.
And if you have this really high intelligence and really great capability, but there's other things derailing you during the day because you can't understand or you can't, process that visual environment efficiently, they work really hard too. So.
Right. So while we can all have CAPD, for kids with autism, there seems to be something unique in that it's really, really common to have CAPD.
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about one more thing before we get into kind of what we can do about all this, right? In my practice, I see a lot. I'm in the business of sometimes diagnosing autism or undiagnosing autism. And I definitely, I'll see these kids who are quirky, they're shy, they might be really visual in their learning style, and they have an auditory processing disorder, and they've been diagnosed with autism. But when I look at them, I don't feel like they meet the criteria. And I think this is where we get into kind of what was the title of this topic, which is autism, central auditory processing disorder, or both. I think that we could spend a little time on that, if that's okay. Just talking about, in other words, just because you have an auditory processing disorder or sensory processing issues, quirky learning style, and you're shy, that doesn't mean you have autism.
Right. Because, if you can't understand your world, you can't engage. Again, if I go to a foreign country where I don't speak the language, it's not going to take me long to disconnect, start looking, around when people are talking to me. So we can never say whether it's autism, central auditory processing, or both. The only thing we know with our database testing, which is why I love what we do, because we diagnose based off data, according to strict testing criteria and norm-based scores, is whether this is a piece. We don't know what else may be on the plate. But, we've seen where, again, the characteristics of central auditory processing and autism are very similar. We've had students actually lose that autism diagnosis once they could understand their world. That's not the majority. And we never tell parents, that's not our area of expertise. We stay in our lane.
This is not a cure for autism.
No, and that is not my lane. I do not diagnose autism, and that is just not my specialty. But in our experience, some parents call back and say, wow, it was really that they were overloaded. And it might not have been our piece, just our piece. It might have been a visual processing piece too, where where the input to that child was inconsistent in multiple sensory modalities, not just the listening, but the visual and the sensory. So, I think they just look very similar, and it's really hard to know what's what until you can isolate these systems. And like I said, I have a wonderful career where I'm very fortunate to have assessments that are data-based to do that.
That's great. So, and by the way, let me add just one little caveat here. If you can't process what you're seeing and you can't process what you're hearing and your sensory system is on go, you're going to
Right.
look kind of ADD also,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I've always, whenever I get a kid that's diagnosed with ADD or ADHD in particular, I immediately go to auditory and visual because these kids who need a ton of information coming in and can't get past their visual and auditory system, those kids are all over the place.
Yes.
And sometimes that, is a misdiagnosis of ADHD because they look like they meet the symptom criteria, but once you address the auditory and vision, all of a sudden, magically, the ADHD goes away. So, kind of the same idea that it's hard to discriminate these things without looking at these pieces separately.
It's so hard because a lot of them overlap and look exactly the same. And
Exactly. Yeah.
so it's so hard for especially parents who are getting all this information, and their child can fit, maybe multiple areas.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about what can be done. In other words, we have a kid and we suspect or have been assessed and have determined that we have central auditory processing, particularly for, again, focusing on these kids who are on the autism spectrum. What can we actually do about that once we have that piece isolated?
So our profession recommends, and audiologists utilize many different management strategies. I'll talk about the foundations first, and then I'll also talk about what else is out there. So at the foundation, we really rely on compensatory management, which is the classic preferential seating, quiet room for testing, visuals, common sense strategies that really, Marlo, are helpful for all of us during the day.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And really important when you have auditory processing challenges too. And, I always find it interesting to talk to adults and parents and teachers because we don't realize that as adults, we typically have far more control over our environment during the day. I'm talking to you in a quiet room with it's just me and you right now. I don't have 20 peers doing other things in this room. A lot of adults have their own separate office at home. Teachers typically get, albeit they might not be long breaks, but they'll get little breaks during the day when their kids go to lunch and recess and gym and music. Our kids don't get those breaks. They're with their group of peers or their siblings or their friends, all day. And so the goal is to try to, carve out time where they get little periods of quiet like we do during the day, but also that they have access to tools like headphones and being close to the teacher and things like that. Really helpful. These things have been recommended, for decades and are widely recommended across the world for students and adults with central auditory processing. The other component to the foundation is what's called the filter. In the early 90s, Colorado State discovered the benefits of a passive filter for mitigating central auditory processing challenges. So when you have central auditory processing difficulties, those ears are out of sync. And Colorado State discovered that when you wear a passive filter in one ear, it helps to balance that system better together. We looked at 1,000 students a couple years ago. We kind of repeated the initial research that Colorado State did because we'd been doing it for a long time, and I was just curious what the averages came out to be. On average, when you looked at 1,000 students that had inefficient systems, their ability to understand speech information in quiet was 60%. So imagine reading a book with 40% of the information missing during the day. You're going to get the main idea. You're going to use context. You're going to use other strategies to try and fill in the gaps, but that's all hard. It takes time, it takes effort, and you're going to miss important information you're going to be held accountable for in the future. With the use of a filter, that group's understanding improved to 84%. So it gave them access to 24% more information during their day, which is huge. Huge.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I liken it to glasses. It doesn't change the system, the Able Kids Foundation spoke to me because it was the first time in my professional career where I could offer another solution to parents that was affordable, easy to access, and to know instantly that if you chose to get a filter and wear it, you were helping that system be more efficient. The other thing that a lot of audiologists recommend is what's called an auditory FM system, where the teacher wears the microphone and that student has a headset or speaker system. Some schools are actually working on putting classroom FM systems in every class in the district because they know that improved auditory input is helpful for everybody, whether you have central auditory processing challenges or not. These systems aren't always widely available. They're more expensive. But they're really helpful for students if you do have access to a personal unit or a speaker system. From my readings, the first recommendation for the FM system for central auditory processing challenges came out in 1978. So that recommendation has been around for a really long time. Outside the foundation, some other things that audiologists may recommend are hearing aids. We don't recommend hearing aids because I haven't seen hearing aids outperform the filter, yet they seem to help individuals. So, I think sometimes we've heard from some of our families that with the use of hearing aids, the auditory system was overwhelmed even more, and it wasn't helpful for the child. But our systems are all different. What works for you, Marlo, may not work as well for me, and vice versa. So, hearing aids are a strategy that some audiologists utilize, as well as some sound-based therapies. I mentioned I had done therapies in the past, and I saw great benefits with some of them regarding academic skills, anxiety. It felt like kids just were more comfortable in their own skin, which was huge. You just felt this, and you saw the kids just be calmer. But I wasn't finding, and there's still a lack of research showing that therapies can help one system understand in noise. We're tracking that at the foundation too. A lot of our students do therapies prior to coming to the foundation. So we're tracking kind of what therapies they've done and what their system is still doing after the therapy. But it's an option that's out there for families that have access to that resource. And I never discourage families from doing something they feel like is best for their child. Even though I haven't seen the research to support that your child can sit and focus better in noise after doing, interactive metronome or the listening therapy, I've seen other benefits. And if that therapy helps to make your child's life easier in another way, then go for it.
It's interesting because I actually talked with the founder of what used to be Center for Interchange, is now is ILS, Integrated Listening System. We won't name names, but I talked to him a lot of years ago and asked him, what is the deal? Like, I don't see pre-test, post-test changes in the scores, but I do see kids different. So I had a school for 10 years and they donated listening therapy to every kid in the building. And we really saw some nice effects. And so I asked him, what am I seeing? I'm seeing the effects, but the test scores don't change a lot. And it was very fascinating because he told me that he really believed that what was happening is that listening therapy, whether it's ILS or Simonis or interactive metronome or some of these other ones, that it's actually calming down the central nervous system at a vagus nerve level, which I thought was really, which then gives kids more energy to attend to sensory information without being their whole system, without overstimulating their whole system so much. So we have an interview in this section that was done with ILS. In fact, it was the one of the people over at ILS who's really knows the research very, very well with integrated listening. And she really talked about how listening therapy is calming down that central nervous system also. And that kind of is consistent with what you're saying, even though the scores may not change a lot in terms of data. We do see that for some of these kids, that listening therapy is really, really helpful. And it may be working at a deeper level, even within the sensory system or within the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, which is calming things down so that we have more energy left over for listening.
Yes. And I don't want to give the impression I'm against those therapies.
Right,
because
exactly.
I would not trade my experience that I had for anything. I saw incredible things from um, motor, challenges improving. Tomatis especially was thought to hit that vagus nerve. So I saw gut issues improve with my students, which is huge. I mean, if
Right.
you feel better that way, that's amazing.
Yep.
I saw kids with really extreme speech and language challenges, some that just had this oral motor, difficulty. And I watched one kid say mama for the first time to his mother. It was like it woke up,
Yeah.
part of the nervous system. That probably is still the best moment of her life when her little boy said mama for the first time. I saw it help with kids getting potty trained. It was like it woke up, like they were just so under responsive in their nervous system that they just weren't aware, of their
Right.
body. It was like it woke up a lot of their nervous system. So that is where, I encourage parents to do what they think is best for their kiddos,
Right.
without the expectation again that it might not change the noise.
Exactly. And it's interesting because you talk about I had a client, 17-year-old kid, that started talking for the very first time after doing Tomata space listening therapy.
Yeah,
So pretty powerful stuff. Now
incredible.
he didn't keep talking for a long time and he kind of regressed back, but it was so interesting that those correlated pretty tightly with literally the first week of listening therapy starts talking for the first time ever. So in other words, there's a lot here we don't understand
Yes.
about how these systems all fit together, kind of at a really deep system level. But I think what you guys are doing is an important piece. So spend a little bit more time talking to us about your filter, because not all filters are created equal. I know there's some other kind of standardized filters, musician's ear being one of those. Talk about your filter and what makes your filter unique.
Sure. So there's a lot of different earplugs. There's a lot of different filters. Some filters, have a cutoff, a musician's earplugs, or there's some that people use for their occupations, in dentistry, where, the goal is to cut that louder sound so that it doesn't harm, the hearing mechanism while still allowing them to understand speech. So a lot of filters have some sort of overall dampening or sound suppression component to it. It's important when you're utilizing a filter for the central auditory processing system that it does not reduce hearing. So the filter that we use is modified so that hearing is still within the range of normal. We're not trying to put an earplug in somebody's ear. We don't want them walking around with an earplug. Their hearing is great. We don't want an added hearing loss on top of their their processing challenges. So all filters are custom made for the ear. We take a mold and then they're modified as well to ensure that, again, it's not an earplug. Off the shelf, they're an earplug. But hearing still within the range of normal. It's always one ear, never both. And testing determines, one, whether that filter is going to be helpful, and two, which ear should be fit. And I love that because that's information that we can give to the families so that they have, again, the data to decide what they would like to do for their child.
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate you talking and defining that, because I actually owned some musicians' earphones. I had a head trauma and was fitted with the two-ear musicians' ear filters that helped, but it also threw me off in ways I
Mhm.
can't kind of explain in terms of balance and just other
Mhm.
things. It was kind of weird wearing them. So
Yeah.
so we're literally almost out of time. I want to first of all thank you for coming today and just tell you how much I appreciate it. I'd also like to close kind of on a topic of kind of, I think I've heard you say this and we haven't really covered it in this session. You kind of use this analogy of the glasses. Let's go back to that a little bit and really kind of close on that, because I think it's a really nice point with the idea that, you know, we wouldn't expect our children to just work harder to try and see if their eyes weren't working. So can you
Right.
share that analogy? Because I think you do a much better job of explaining it than I do.
Yeah. I think we all relate to the visual system very easily. That auditory system is just a little bit more complex and foreign to us. And we would never ask a student with low vision to sit in the back of the room, and we wouldn't turn out the lights. and we wouldn't write small on the board, and ask them to just, try their best every day. We would never give a blind person a book every day and say, just go try harder. I know you can do it. You're a hard worker. You're so smart. Just keep trying harder. The same holds true for our students with central auditory processing challenges. If we don't support them and we don't give them tools to quiet their environment, and we don't preferentially seat them and give them access to visuals. There's a lot more than what we talked about. We're asking them to do the same thing. So, it's all about leveling their playing field. And these kids are amazing, as we learn, I think, just as much from kids as we sometimes share with the parents. And when you can't understand your environment, and when your environment is noisier than it should be, and that's on your plate all day, you never get a break. You never get a break. It's 24/7. And so simply taking this piece off the plate, it might not be the only piece of that child's puzzle. A lot of times with, the autism group, it's not, but it's one less thing. If you can imagine that, everybody with autism has a backpack full of bricks, and they might have auditory processing and the sensory processing and anxiety and all these things that these kids have to worry about. If we can take those bricks that are due to the auditory piece out of their bag, it's less load that they have to carry during the day.
That's great. One more thing I'll close on. I have so many times people like, well, I know my child doesn't have this because he or she listens to their headphones all the time and listens to music, and it's actually pretty loud. And I have learned through the years that these kids who listen to this really predictable playlist, they're not actually listening to it. They're using it to drown out us. In other words, the brain is not hearing that music. It's just loud enough to drown out everything else. And so that in and of itself is sometimes indication of a central auditory processing disorder, especially when they listen to the exact same playlist over and over and over and over. That can be almost telling in terms of that is the filter. That playlist becomes the filter.
That's, it all boils down to control. That's
Right.
a sound that they're controlling. That's predictable. You had talked about those unpredictable noises earlier. It's predictable. It's something that they're choosing, and it's a steady state. And so we get that question all the time. Sometimes it's TV at a loud volume. And I'll say, well, if that TV's cranked up and that's what the child's trying to focus on, it helps to drown out, the cooking or the phone or whatever else is going on in the house that's disruptive. So, wearing headphones, listening to music, TV at a loud volume, even humming and talking a lot to yourself. Again, that gives you input. You're controlling your environment. So yeah, some of these things don't at the start necessarily look like sensitivities, but once you understand the reason behind the behavior, it makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed speaking with you today. And again, we're here with Dr. Megan Locke from the Able Kids Foundation. And I appreciate everybody who's joining us in this session. And thanks for being with us. You can go to our website where Dr. Locke's information is there and access content about how to reach the able kids if you'd like to do that. So thanks everybody for being with us. Appreciate your time today. Have a great day.